Thank you, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the COVID-19 pandemic and the Western Balkans, organized by the Istituto Affari Internazionali, which since the very beginning of the lockdown has moved its activities online to the largest extent possible. I'm Gabriele Rosana, and I'm the managing editor of Affari Internazionali, the online magazine of IAI. Before starting, please make sure that all your microphones are muted, since the platform spots who's speaking and feature them in the video, and also because, as a point of information, today's meeting is being recorded. I'm happy to welcome online with us today our panelists. I will start in alphabetical order, but that will not be the order we will follow afterwards. Adi Cerimagic, researcher of the European Stability Initiative in Berlin. Renzo Davidi, former officer of the European External Action Service and today's consultant. Crisela Achkai, director of the Cooperation and Development Institute in Tirana. Zoran Nechev, researcher of the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje. Sherdan Majstorovic, chairman of the governing board of the European Policy Center. Together with them, as we saw from the introduction, they come from various countries in the region. Together with them, we will try to analyze the impact of COVID-19 in both at national and European level, and especially in a European perspective. Indeed, amid the coronavirus crisis, the European Council has recently given the green light to start accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania, and that's the first point of our talk today. And while worldwide infections surged past 2 million, we have also seen been seeing competing images coming from the region, with shipment of medical aid from China to Serbia, while Albania was sending medical professionals to Italy in a move to highlight European solidarity just a few days after the decision of the European Council. I will leave all these topics, of course, for the interventions of our speakers and later for the debate. A few rules for today's online conversation. We have 1 hour sharp. We've been using that format already, and it proves to be quite efficient in online setting. But please do stick to the 5-minute time that in your interventions. Time management, as we all know, is not the best Italian asset of all, so please help me with that. As I said before, if you're not speaking, please mute your mic. And after the 5-minute intervention from all our speakers, we will then move to a question and answers. And if you want to speak, please make sure to raise your hand. There is a button here on Zoom, on the platform for that. So make sure to raise your hand or contact me in chat. Drop me a line and I will give you the floor. So yeah, just let's get started. And then it's my pleasure to give the floor to the representative of one of the 2 countries I mentioned before, in this case, Albania. Crisela Achkai, director of the Cooperation and Development Institute in Tirana. 5 minutes, please. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriele. Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all. And well, now it's the mood of this month. I mean, talking to everybody online and get connected somehow. Where usually we at CDI are studying connectivity in other terms, but now it seems that connectivity, online connectivity is becoming the normal. Well, regarding Albania and how we are dealing at the national level with this crisis, because it's obscuring basically everything from the talks to, I mean, from the accession talks to normal economic policies to other, let's say, priority policies. So we are now our, let's say, daily discussion in the media, in the public. It's always about the crisis that this pandemic situation is already causing. And it's multidimensional. It's affecting economy, it's affecting relationship between the citizen, the state and the institution. It's affecting social life, how we in the community are behaving, but it's also affecting, and this is very important to us as CDI in terms of our research, is affecting the weak institution, the weak, let's say, democracy that we have in our country. In the first phase of the crisis, basically, the government has managed to do a good job, basically. And it adopted several measures that somehow didn't put panic into the situation, didn't put panic into the population. We didn't see, for example, like a panic situation in the supermarkets or everywhere, you know, like we have seen, for example, in other, you know, European medias. So in terms of awareness, in terms of behavior of the society, I should say that there has been a good level of awareness in terms of response level from the society. And this is a very good starting, let's say, approach to tackle the crisis. Also, the Albanian government has introduced several financial relief measures, especially for the small and medium enterprises, which are basically family-owned ones. And these are very crucial when it comes to analyze the social impact that this crisis is having in Albania. Basically, we talked, you mentioned, Gabriele, the 30 doctors that Albania has sent to Italy. I mean, the little Albania, you know, helping our, you know, neighbor, big country neighbor. And it was a sign of solidarity, of course, and also a sign of friendship that Albania managed to demonstrate to Italy, who has been basically there since the fall of the communism, basically in the early 90s, but also 1997 when we had the crisis, etc. And we talked so much about this and so less about European accession talks, basically, which was not anymore in the media. So basically, now the new normal, it's solidarity are the social values, we call them, solidarity, health, let's say, policies, education policies. So now there is a switch in the discussion, also in terms of involvement of civil society to which the policy priorities are, basically. And it turns out from this crisis that we need to invest a lot in research. We need to invest a lot in health and education policies. We need to invest a lot in that part of the economy that is really very much connected to Italy. And we have, this is basically the main discussion here, that the most negative impact that the Albanian economy will have is basically that part of the economy which is already integrated in the value chain with Italy. So basically, COVID came here, you know, and we were discussing in the end of February, basically, and early March, that we are so much connected that we will have COVID for sure, because we are so much connected to Italy, and we have daily flights, and we have a lot of trade with Italy. So basically, we are now having a discussion on which part of the economy is really important to support the rebuilding, the reconstruction of the economy. In terms of the accession talks, and we as CDI basically have supported so much the revision of the enlargement strategy, of the enlargement methodology, because it's really some of the highlights in that new proposal of the Commission really reflect the needs that this process has shown so far. And now what we are doing basically is supporting with our research on how to build the roadmap for the democratic institutions. Because in Albania, what we really are, let's say, impacted a lot, also in our daily work, is the work that institutions do, the way they, let's say, provide services to the citizens, the way they conduct their daily business with the economic sector. So basically, we expect the European Commission now to, let's say, prepare the negotiating framework to be proposed for the European Council, and this is the next step in the order. And a positive, of course, decision of the European Council in terms of adopting that kind of negotiating framework and putting there the basis for more scrutiny when it comes to how the institutions work. This is our, let's say, biggest challenge when it comes to do the reforms. So it's not just ticking the boxes and yes, on the paper we have, delivered on the reforms, and we are producing some numbers and some statistics, but it's also what goes, let's say, there inside the institutions, how they are performing. It's the throughput legitimacy, we call it like that. So it's not just what they do produce in terms of what the process requires from us, but it's also how really they are, transformed in a democratic way and are delivering to the citizens. So this is a crucial point that needs to be really very good and very, very professionally addressed in the new negotiating framework. So this is as a first, let's say, intervention from my side. But I mean, of course, the topic is so wide and it's so multidimensional. So we can maybe pick up later several, the topics.
Thank you, Christelle. Indeed, yeah, you mentioned the revised methodology, but also the future start of the accession talks. There is no set date at the moment for the start of the talks with Tirana and Skopje, but indeed, let's see what the views from Skopje or from North Macedonia, both on the COVID outbreak and the future European perspective of the countries are. So I would like now to give the floor again 5 minutes to Zoran Nechev, who's researcher of the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje. Thank you. Okay. And you have the floor, Zoran.
Thank you. So when I was preparing the speech this morning, I was just trying to find my angle, and I decided to present it in a way of a scenario of a theater show. So I will present you like four scenes. And the first one is how it should have been. So 2020 should have been about, all about fanfare and celebration for North Macedonia. Finally, we have become a part of the NATO family, and the Council has reached a decision for opening accession negotiation. This happened 19 years after signing the Stabilization and Association Agreement, more than a decade after receiving the first recommendation for open accession negotiation, and finally 12 years after we have been denied membership in NATO due to the name issue. In regards to the updates, because I've seen that you started that debate, updates on the EU accession process, the government was insisting on starting the bilateral screenings before the negotiation framework is being prepared, so meaning before the first intergovernmental conference, but because of the COVID-19, everything has been delayed. So obviously the bilateral screenings will start after the intergovernmental conference. So that's the scene one, how it should have been. Scene two is how it turned out to be. So we had the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. What we have today are daily updates provided by the Minister of Health about the number of infected. For our country is 974. How many cured and deceased? So that's around 45. The latest information provided by BIRN network about the whole of the Western Balkans is about 40,000 plus people in the region tested positively for COVID-19, with 1,000 plus reported death. That's in the Western Balkans. Out of that, 1,000 is infected from North Macedonia. Therefore, no celebrations, neither in Washington, in Brussels, nor in Skopje. 4 days ago, we should have had out to the ballot boxes and vote on early parliamentary elections. However, again, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, the elections have been postponed. A new date will be set once the pandemic is finished. Because of the elections, we now have a technical government headed by a technical prime minister, which obviously will stay in power during the crisis. According to the constitution, it should have stayed for 60 days. That's before the elections, in order to prepare for the elections. But now, obviously, it will take a while, more time than that. So Macedonian Assembly was dissolved on February 16. Scene 3, reality kicks in. So we have a technical government in power that includes also the opposition party. So one of the main ministries during this crisis, the Ministry of Interior, is headed by a minister from the opposition party, from VMRO. Parliament is out of session in times when the country is facing one of the biggest crises in its recent history, a crisis that puts on test the entirety of the society, the resilience of the state institutions, and above all, the health system. And it has shown that the country needs to put much more efforts in fostering resilient institutions and capacities able to respond to this kind of situations. Because of the harsh restrictive measures that our government impose, very similar to those in Serbia, as put forward in times of emergency, this extended Eastern weekend, we will have 85 hours restriction for not going out of our homes completely, with the exception of people that have dogs. They can go out for 3 times per day. And so all these restrictive measures are mainly driven by fear and distrust between the citizens and institutions, and the weak capacities of the health system, but not only, it's also the police. So the health institution to cope and to respond accordingly to this emerged situation. So obviously the whole, keeping calm and everything will be okay because we are resilient enough was not working out, and these kind of measures need to be imposed. So therefore, it is better to close, cancel, and restrict rather than to regret later with the consequences. So that was the whole point of this very restrictive measures. Because from the other side, if you look at the data, the curve, the fear of the curve going up, like in Italy, never happened. So we have a steady increase of people infected, and the health system can cope with it. Actually, with restricting more these measures, now it's starting, the people to react. So we will see how that will go. So, can I just finish the scenes for?
Yes, please, the 4th scene, indeed.
Okay, so given this situation, there is always a risk of the government will be abused. So that's why we need a parliament which can, oversight the whole decision making process and counterweight the executive branch of power. And it's also important to have a parliament, so MPs to be included in the decision making process, because during these emergency times, according to our legislation, you can conduct public procurements according to the negotiation procedure. That means in 4 eyes. Sit me and Matteo, and we will decide on the public procurement. So this is the least transparent procedure, and you don't have to obtain a notice or approval by the Public Procurement Bureau, which increases the risk of corruption without having any political institution conducting oversight. Just left for a couple of NGOs that really, formally look at the process of public procurement. So I will stop here.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Zoran, and thanks again for sticking to the allocated time slot. Spoken about North Macedonia and Albania. Now I would like to move to an outlook about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I would like to give the floor to Adi Cherimagic, who's researcher at the European Stability Initiative in Berlin. Adi, you have the floor. 5 minutes, thanks.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, or good day, and thanks for having me and us. Maybe I've decided to put the 5-minute intervention around 5 questions that I've mostly got in the past couple of weeks that are regarding Bosnia and Herzegovina and COVID-19 reaction. First question is the COVID-19 situation under control in Bosnia and Herzegovina? And if you look at the number of confirmed cases and number of deaths, one could conclude that the situation is, at least compared to places where the pandemic has hit more severely in Europe, that it is under control. By 13th of April, we had around 1,100 confirmed cases and 40 deaths. The governments have reacted within 10 to 15 days with introduction of most of the measures that were recommended by the World Health Organization and the experts when it comes to closing down schools, canceling public events, encouraging social distancing, and working from home for those who can. And since then, for example, since 19th of March, the doubling of the confirmed cases was happening every 2 days. On 13th of April, the doubling was happening every 11.5 days. So experts say that that shows that the measures have worked. However, I'm not an expert for pandemics, so I'll just tell you what the experts who are following Bosnia-Herzegovina say. They warn about two things. First thing is that too few tests are being done, that not all people are being tested, and that because of that, situation could be much worse. But also they say that the extension or expansion of testing capacities is happening in Bosnia. For example, in first 15 days, we only had 600 tests being conducted in total, while in the last 5 days, we had over 4,500 tests done within 5 days. Whether that's enough, I really don't know. And the second thing, what Soran mentioned, that the measures that the governments have introduced, such as total ban of outdoor activities for those older than 65, younger than 18, and police curfews, that those measures are so strict that over a longer period, they're not sustainable. So they will lead to people disobeying, going out, and things getting worse in a second way. So that's on the COVID-19. The second question that I get is, has Bosnian federalism, or the fact that we have so many health ministries, Dayton Agreement, etc., made things worse? And there I have to caution everyone first to understand that the health sector in Bosnia in general, across the board, is very poorly governed and managed. So we have a very bad health system in general. When it comes to the fact that we had different governments in charge in different parts of the countries, you could see it as a bad thing. It would have been better if we had a better health system that was governed from one place and governed well. But taking into account that it's poorly governed across the board, it seems that also this federalism worked in favor of Bosnia. So, for example, in Banja Luka, where we had first cases and where until today we have quarter of all cases confirmed, reaction by the ministry there could have been quicker than if one was waiting for the reaction, for example, in Sarajevo. Same thing we can observe in Tuzla area or in Zenica area, where basically because they have some of the instruments in their hand, they could react more quickly and more independently from how the things are being governed, for example, in Canton Sarajevo. So we need to be cautious there about making final judgments on whether that has been a weakness or a strength of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The third question is, how are politicians in Bosnia reacting to all this? And to surprise of many, they have been reacting with several incidents of fighting and what is usually considered a dynamic of Bosnian politics. They have been reacting quite responsibly. The presidency has made several decisions. They had a joint statement for citizens. Entity ministries are cooperating among each other. They're recognizing each other's documents very quickly. And there are, of course, many troubles, but what we see in the practice is not as bad as one has the image of Bosnia and expectation of Bosnia. Fourth question is, what are the internationals doing? We have this Peace Implementation Council that some of you might know about. It's where all the internationals come together and judge the situation in Bosnia. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, we had for the first time in many years a joint statement that Russia subscribed to, and that was dominantly positive about the reaction of the government in Bosnia. So that's, for example, something new. Head of EU delegation was standing next to the US ambassador after an agreement on how to divide IMF money, which is also interesting taking into account EU-US relations elsewhere. in the region. China's support hasn't been like in Serbia, but we have seen China's support, and only 2 incidents by internationals was actually by Russia and Hungary, which have decided to direct their support only to Banja Luka, which has provoked political bickering and reactions in the other part of the country and have destabilized relations. And of course, from our eastern neighbor, Serbia, Minister of Defense this week said that the Serbian military will invade Bosnia in case things get worse, but some will say that that's normal, what we should expect from Vulin to say. And the 5th question, and that is the last question, what the EU should do. So health sector in Bosnia and Herzegovina across the board is very poor. We don't have enough protective equipment. We need to make sure that our health workers are protected. We will desperately need financial support. If we look at the government's budgets for 2020 and what the outcomes will be, it's difficult to understand how far this will be, but the financial support will be needed. EU has provided some support, but that is not enough, and it will not be enough. And I would suggest to everyone to try to refrain from picking in Bosnia, picking sides and contributing to creation of interstate problems in this situation in particular. So I would caution everyone to be careful. Also, that was my last point to also fellow colleagues, but also to diplomats and to others. Let's be careful and very detailed when we analyze what's happening, not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but what is happening in the Western Balkans, because these are situations when people are on the edge emotionally and in other points. So we really need to be careful and pinpoint concrete things and look into details before we make conclusions that could have consequences that we do not want. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi, for a very comprehensive perspective on Bosnia and Herzegovina and on the region as a whole. And you spoke about Belgrade. And now I would like then to give the floor to Srdan Mestorovic, who's chairman of the governing body of the European Policy Center in Serbia, for again a view from Belgrade on the COVID-19 outbreak and the region as a whole. Thank you, and Srdan, you have the floor. 5 minutes, please. Thanks.
Grazie, Gabriele, and thank you to IAI for keeping the Western Balkans in the focus in this difficult moment for not only Europe, but Italy especially. And yeah, it's not easy to speak from the home quarantine, preparing for a 3 days lockdown. There are a lot of things to be addressed, but I would speak about democracy and the dangers for democracy in the time of the state of emergency. As you know, the pandemic came to Serbia on the eve of the forthcoming general elections. And unfortunately, these elections were already controversial due to democratic deficiencies with regards the conditions for these elections. And obviously, the question of legitimacy of these elections were on the table. Issues like access to media for the opposition parties, electoral lists, financing of political campaigns, public function abuse in the campaign. These were all issues that already set the scene for very clear, as I said, deficiencies of the functioning of democracy at this moment in Serbia. And due to this previous experience with regards respect to the rule of law, division of power, and dominant role of the executive over the legislative and judicial power, continuous submission of independent institutions, breach of media freedoms and freedom of expression, it is difficult to escape from impression that authoritarian nature of the governance in Serbia will gain additional strength during this and after pandemic, during this crisis and after pandemic is over. Somebody very nicely described it as authoritarianism on steroids, as a potential outcome of this crisis. And the first signs are already visible. and are not encouraging. The very way that the state of emergency was introduced is questionable from the position of Constitution of Republic of Serbia. There were other legal possibilities as well. Then the role of the parliament was completely abolished, I would say, already as regardless of the fact that the elections are being already called, our parliament, not as in Macedonia, was not dismissed. So it should have been functioning at this moment, and it is not. Repression over the media, apprehension of journalists are also very descriptive ways of the behavior of the authoritarian government. And we also pioneered something which is called Skype court rulings and Skype practice during this. I mean, the cases in front of the judiciary are being held without the presence of those who are accused for breaching the rules of the emergency. All of this implies that basic trust between citizens and state is seriously undermined, and obviously restrictive measures, which are, as I describe, often disproportional, are set or pitted against the democratic values of dialogue and education of the public. Motive is to, on behalf of the government, is obviously to explain why this government is the only one who can provide salvation from this crisis. And that is why, in its attempt to divert public attention from the ill-prepared and neglected health system, and indecisive and panic first official reactions, government resort to criticizing the EU and to praise China as a sort of a plan B possibility for Serbia. And the way to mobilize anti-EU and nationalistic sentiments, which is always very useful fuel before the forthcoming elections. And we all know that reality is completely different, although there are some elements of the first reaction from EU that could have been avoided. But to cut this introduction short, there are two possibilities before us after this pandemic is over. In the case that Serbia and Western Balkan 6 are left alone after this political crisis, it is easy to expect that Serbia will emerge more authoritarian from this crisis, with all the grave consequences that implies the lack of rule of law, the deficient democratic institutions and procedures, further breaches of the individual rights of citizens. Economic and social consequences are going to be grave also, and that will leave Serbia and the other countries in the region more open for foreign influence. The lack of current progress in the normalization of relations with Kosovo will also probably going to be continued and occasionally abused as a factor of anti-EU and nationalistic narratives in Serbia. But this is only if the Western Balkans are neglected, and only if the EU does not recognize that the crisis is also an opportunity to reset its own global agenda and to include Western Balkans as an integral part in its play, in its attempt to play an important role on the global scene as well. In that, if the EU continues to support the Western Balkans and the opening of the accession talks with Albania and Macedonia, and the plans for economic support that Commissioner Verhali just announced are encouraging. Obviously, that would set the whole region with additional possibilities, and the European Commission's newly proposed methodology sets the possibility to include Western Balkans into the EU policy in a more inclusive way. It also enables European Union to motivate those who are real frontrunners and sanction those who are not ready to adhere to the rules of the game. But what is very important for the EU and the region is that when assessing the future role of the EU, the Western Balkans are included in any further strategic planning, especially with regards to the EU-China relations. This goes from the productivity and supply dependency of the region on Chinese products and the EU as well, all the way through the climate accords, to the environmental issues, to the tech-related issues, which are becoming very, very present in the region with the stronger presence of China through its tech companies, all the way to the connectivity, Belt and Road Initiative, and the role of the Western Balkans in the critical EU infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Sherdan. I think...
okay, my time is out.
Sorry to cut you short. Yeah, I mean, I think that there will be time and chance also in the Q&As, maybe to touch upon issues that were not mentioned, but topical point you made is the EU ready to live up to the expectations and the ambitions of the Western Balkan countries? And indeed, we have listened to the voices coming from these countries. So now I would like to conclude the first round of interventions, to move to Renzo Davidi, who's former official of the EEAS, the European External Action Service. And I would like him indeed to give us more of a European picture and European reading of what has been said so far. And you have the floor, Mr. Davidi.
Thank you very much. I am really pleased to be with you. It's a pleasure also because I see a large number of young and bright researchers that are taking part in this webinar, and I'm very pleased that I can be part of this discussion. If you allow me, I would like to focus on the economy, and especially on the future, on the perspective. And let me say at the very beginning, from the outset, that I'm not particularly optimistic. If we look at the situation, and some of these points were already recalled by the previous speaker, all in all, the response, as in terms of the health response, has been rather prompt, basically in all countries that we are part of the Western Balkans, where I see that the response has been less prompt and perhaps not entirely up to the necessity is in terms of the economic response. This is particularly significant in some of the countries, and especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I think that some of the problems have been complicated by the very complex institutional and political situation. But I'm sure we might have a chance to discuss this later on or in another occasion. Let me try to turn very briefly and very quickly into the future. And of course, it's always very difficult to look at some forecasting. It is particularly difficult in this case when the extent of the problem is largely unknown. In the past few days, you might have seen that the International Monetary Fund has released some new forecast, the World Economic Outlook for April 2020. And there is, of course, a number of indications that concern also the Western Balkan countries. There is clearly an overall negative outcome of the world as a whole, and in this respect, the Western Balkans are not an exception. I still believe that probably the outcome that is depicted is quite optimistic, and let me try to recall a couple of elements. When we look at the income to the GDP, the gross domestic product, the IMF is assuming a very prompt rebound already in 2021. Next year, most of the economy will start growing again, getting into some positive economic growth. This is under an assumption of a relatively short lockdown, 1 month, 1.5 months. If we think that we are already a month into a lockdown for many of those countries, and that perhaps this lockdown will be a little bit longer, the more an L-shaped curve is in the cards more than a V curve. Unemployment is rather stable at the current high rate, and again, this is a bit counterintuitive, because in some countries, firms have already started to fire workers, and even more, there is evidence that some of the workers employed abroad are coming back. The impact on public finance, as expected, is quite significant and negative, of course, in the short term. Yet, with the exception, especially in the case of BIH and Serbia, the IMF already forecast a return to positive budget outcome in 2021. The current account and the balance of payment is also in line with trends of the previous year, and this is again not very easy to explain. Let me try to recall a few elements of why I have a more pessimistic assessment. The first is of a general nature. The shock that is hitting the economy is symmetric and is global and is diffused worldwide, and has an intensity that probably has not been measured before in any kind of economic system. And this is contrary to the kind of economic shocks that we have been observing until now, which were mostly focused either on one country or in a group of countries, have not the same intensity across country, and the focus was very often in specific sectors. Now we are in a situation where, with the lockdown, some of the economies in many countries are completely grounded, and this has an impact on the economic activity, which is massively negative. In the Western Balkans, I think there are three areas where the global crisis is affecting. One is related to demand and trade. Of course, there are some effects on the supply chain. My understanding is that these effects are not particularly significant, but some are there. What is perhaps more important in the case of the Western Balkans is that the recession in main partner countries is reducing demand for goods and services which are being exported by the Western Balkans. The second element, which I think is important to take into account, is the question of remittances. As we know, we don't have no time to get into the details, but remittances has been one of the main financing item of the balance of payments of all the Western Balkan countries, with incredible contribution in some of them. And finally, the third element, which I think is important, is that foreign financial assistance is in some of the Western Balkan countries is more significant. Some of those countries are still relying on higher resources from donors and from the international financial institutions than many other countries in the world. Another element which I think is important to take into account, and we discussed it briefly when we were chit-chatting at the beginning, is the massive negative effect on tourism and hospitality industry. And this is particularly significant, I'm afraid, for Croatia, Montenegro, or Albania, but is also significant for other countries. That's also one of the reasons why the highest decline in GDP is exactly in countries like Croatia and Montenegro, as forecasted by the IMF. And let's say, in terms of a moderating effect, the structure of this country, the economic structure of this country, is somehow exerting some moderating effect. But I still think that what is ahead of us is a fairly problematic future. Sorry, I thought I was in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Renzo Davidi. And this means that we have concluded our first round of interventions by our panelists. And now I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. I've collected already 3 questions, but please, if you want to make a short intervention, do raise your hand on Zoom. There is a button for that on the upper right. I have 3 questions, as I mentioned. Please introduce yourself and also the person the question is addressed to. And I'd like now to give the floor to André de Munter. You can also unmute yourself, and I see that your video is on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can hear and see.
Good morning to everybody, and nice to see so many familiar faces. I had a question on, I mean, apart from Serbia, where the situation is extremely clear on President Vucic's Twitter account, for instance, there are almost more Chinese flags posted than Serbian flags. I would be interested, like more specifically in the case of, for instance, North Macedonia and Albania, to hear about the way our panelists view the exposure or underexposure of EU aid as opposed to aid coming from other international actors, and maybe some flagrant instances of disinformation in their countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the question then is for whoever wishes to reply.
For Zoran in the first place, and maybe if Adi has some ideas on like aid along ethnic lines, that would be interesting, but we are very limited in time. I'm conscious
Indeed.
of that.
Thanks. Please be also very short then in your answers, and Zoran, and then Adi, you have the floor.
Crisella.
Should we collect some questions first?
We can also, yes, I mean,
yeah, before the time.
Collect some questions, and then you can then note them down and reply all at once. And then in that case, Matteo, you are second in line, and floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I mean, there are so many unknown about all this crisis. I mean, everything looks quite unprecedented. Certainly, I think if we can notice one tendency so far is that there is a reinforcement of the intensity of long trend that we were experiencing so far. Especially, I mean, as we have here also from our speakers, especially in terms of democratization and so on. But I would just like to ask one very short question to our speaker. So how to include the Western Balkans in EU response to the crisis, and what also from an economic perspective they think should be our priority?
Thank you, Matteo. And then last person who registered to intervene is Eleonora Poli. Eleonora, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gabriele, and thank you to all the speakers. I have just a very brief question. What I'm seeing in many European member countries is that the role of the parliament is now undermined by the government. This is happening in Italy, but also in other European member countries. I was listening with particular interest to Serge's intervention about the state of democracy in Serbia, but my question is, do you think this crisis will affect even more democracy and the democratic functioning in the other Western Balkan countries? And do you think that this issue could be used by the EU to delay even more enlargement? Thank you.
Grazie, Eleonora. Then now it's up to the various speakers to answer, and maybe we can start from Crisella again and make another very limited in time round, as we have no more than 8 minutes. But please, Crisella, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be short. There is a problem with the visibility that EU aid and EU financial assistance is having in the Western Balkans. it's a problem of visibility. So actually, the aid that EU has provided to the Western Balkan in terms of quantity, it's much bigger, and compared to basically the aid that is coming from other partners or donors. So this is one of the things and aspects that should be corrected through further, let's say, measures and policies that the EU should adopt in this regard. This is very important, visibility of EU aid in the Western Balkans. Basically, it had, I said it in the very beginning, it had a lot of echo, the 30 doctors that Albania sent to Italy, then the rest of, of the EU accession talks on the EU financial assistance and everything. So it's also about perception, it's also about public, let's say, discussion in the media. So it's also about all these kind of communication, let's say, aspects that should be corrected in while delivering the EU aid, the EU financial assistance. This is one thing. And basically, Albania has received, let's say, from other donors as well, to somehow handle the crisis. So just to mention some of them, China has sent kits, as it has done with other countries. Switzerland, lately Japan also will also provide assistance in health, in medicines and equipment as well. Norway, Turkey as well. So several donors already having activity, already having trade, let's say, trade, let's say, activities with Albania are supporting the country in dealing with the crisis. But in terms of EU aid compared to others, there's no comparison basically in terms of quantity. But there is a correction that should be made to visibility of this funding that is coming to Albania and to the rest of the countries, I suppose. So.
Thank you, Crisela, and then we can maybe quickly move to Zoran for also his reaction to the questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the exposure of aid that is received by the EU, but also individual assistance by certain member states, it's quite visible. So in this country, we don't have that issue at all because some visibility is also given to other donors, such as also the Chinese provided assistance and the Turks, but pretty much if compared to the visibility and appearance of EU and member state assistance in media and throughout the public narrative, then it's obvious that we don't have any problems. In regards to disinformation and fake news, I would not go in that direction. It's more about the whole, the things has changed because also now the opposition party is part of the government. So now it's pretty much who will bring more, who has more friends outside in order to bring more assistance to the country. So I will give you just one example. Slovenia provided 120,000 euros of assistance in medical equipment. So the leader of the opposition party was first on Twitter to announce that he called Janez Janša, because they're part of the same party family, to ask for this assistance. And then the government said this is government to government business. So he might call, but this is pretty much assistance that Slovenia is providing to North Macedonia. So you have this kind of information who will bring more to the country, not that much that is like this information. Parliament, very important, because like this, we don't have anyone to really say or to provide an oversight of what the government is doing. So pretty much a lot of people are against this restriction, very harsh measures of 85 hours of curfew, so no one goes out. But there is actually no one to say it out loud in the public. Pretty much the government proposes and the president of the country accepts it. So pretty much you don't have the parliament to say anything. And in regards to the last question, there are a number of things that the EU, that these countries from the Western Balkan could be integrated in the EU response. from what I have written so far, it's pretty much they're talking about the integral political crisis response mechanism, the EU Center for Disease Protection and Control, and the EU Civil Protection Mechanisms. So these are some of the mechanisms or the instrument in which the country can, these countries from the Western Balkans can be included in this overall EU response to the to tackling COVID-19.
Thank you, Zora, and sorry if I have to cut some of the interventions, but we are really running behind time, and I see also that Ambassador Nicola Minasi has raised his hand, and if he wants to make a short intervention now, or we leave it for afterwards.
Gabriele, can I answer the questions?
Yeah, if you leave me just 1 second, just to understand if I see the hand is not raised anymore. So I will give you the floor, Shrdan, and then...
Yeah, I would like to address the two questions that were addressed to me. One is how can EU support, and this one requires a whole debate on the ways and means. But to cut it short, there are possibilities that arise from the new methodology with regards to a gradual inclusion in different cycle policies. Obviously, speaking from the perspective of fight against pandemic, a closer cooperation that needs to be developed within the EU in order to address these challenges in the future needs to include Western Balkan countries as well. And we need to be very cautious, and this is not a time for bashing this or that side, but there was a lack of geopolitical reflex, I would say, in the decision made by the Commission at the first days of the pandemic, when they basically restricted the trade outside of the EU with medical equipment. That was abused heavily, especially in Serbia, raising the question of the lack of EU solidarity. And it could have been avoided very easily by saying this measure will not apply to the candidate countries, which are already, with their stabilization association agreements, integrated in a common market, in a sense. So this was a very, I would say, the lack of geopolitical reflex in a commission that claims that wants to be geopolitical, that should be avoided in the future. Another way to support is financial, and I guess this was a hypothetical question, bearing in mind that both Dusan and you are here, and that you are fighting this battle to include Western Balkan countries in a structural EU instruments that needs to raise the level of economic convergence of the countries in the region. And that would allow basically an additional leverage to influence the quality of democracy and the quality of the systems and decision-making procedures in the region. When it comes to second question, Eleonora, on the parliament, we need to bear in mind that nothing is going to be the same, and the enlargement process after this pandemic also needs to be redefined and taken into the geopolitical context of the EU's role in the post-pandemic world. What we came up with is that what we hopefully learn from this is that there are a couple of areas of intervention. One, that EU needs to redefine or reset its value base upon which the EU functions. And if EU has no capabilities to say that Mr. Orban is breaching the major founding values of the EU, it is going to be useless to address the issues of lack of democracies in the Western Balkans. These are the alibis which are going to be abused with by the populist in the region. So in that sense, more inclusiveness, as the new methodology is proposing in different policy areas, closer cooperation, but at the same time, more motivation for those who are real frontrunners, and serious sanctions with regards to the access to the finances for the changes in these countries if the governments are not serious in producing the changes which are required.
Thank you, Shrdan. If in 1-2 minutes both Renzo, Davide, and Adi Magic can also make their follow-up interventions, please. And Adi?
Who goes first? I go first. Okay, when it comes to the question of the aid, I made a list like China, Turkey, EU, US have given their aid to Bosnia-Herzegovina. There is a coordinating body that works or works less efficiently that coordinates the aid that comes to the state. The only Serbia and Croatia, of course, traditionally support Serbs and Croats, and that is there is a mutual understanding that that is acceptable in Bosnia-Herzegovina. What was the problem with Hungarian support was, I think that the foreign minister in his statement was listing the states that Hungary has supported, and he said Republika Srpska as one of the countries, North Macedonia, Slovenia, Croatia, and Republika Srpska. And that has then provoked a political reaction in Bosnia and has led to the situation that it came. I think when it comes to disinformation, the biggest starting problem was 15th of March decision. And there I partly agree with Serjan, but also partly disagree in a sense that there should have been also a bit of more cautious from our side in the region, those that are following the issue, but also from politicians to read the actual decision from 15th of March. Because for days, politicians were repeating that ventilators are included, that medicine will not be able to put, and there were only 5 items there. Also, center of the pandemic at that point was in Italy and Spain, so there was supposed to be a little bit of maybe solidarity from our side as well. When it comes to coordination, and that is my last point, I need to stress something that I always say. When there's something to coordinate in Bosnia, things work much better than what the observers and internationals expect. So when we had a health situation, health ministries cooperated among each other without a coordination mechanism or a body or etc. They've exchanged the test kits between each other, they accepted each other's documents, etc., etc. Now we have today, head of the EU delegation announced that there will be a coordinating body on economic reforms and response to economic situation. The problem there is that there is a lack of, where we need to be careful with that is that the problem in Bosnia is always when you don't know what they should be doing. So you can't put them all together. It looks very nice, but then if you don't have content for them to work on, that's where the problems start. And when it comes to economic policy and governance in general in Bosnia, we have a huge problem because a lot of people that are in our governing structures do not know what to do about the economy. So if you have those big bodies and a couple of people that understand the economy and what should be done, actually those kind of things can work counter-effectively in the sense that those people are silenced and have a majority that actually doesn't understand fully what's happening in economy. So we have to be, in that sense, very, very careful. But there were good examples of coordination without the coordination bodies, but there were also good examples of where they coordinate.
Adi, and now I move to Renzo Davidi for final answer too.
Thank you. It's not a final. I think we have so many things that have been would be nice to continue to discuss, but I think I understand that our time is limited. Two very brief observations. The first one is that, unfortunately, the communication problem is a long-standing problem for the European Union. Our incapacity to communicate does not concern only what is being done and what is being done in various countries, including in the Western Balkans, but is also a problem of communicating with the citizens in the European Union itself and how the institutions work and how the interactions among the different countries work. And this crisis, I think, has shown some of the limits of this communication, and I hope that there will be some reflection on that. The second very brief observation is in terms of the enlargement policy. I think that once the emergency crisis has finished, is over, I think we should try to really make a collective effort to bring back into the policy discussion the question of the enlargement. And I think it would be extremely important to start reflecting a little bit more in how this process can be accelerated in the Western Balkans. The new methodology came out at the point when it's not been possible yet to open up this discussion. I hope there will be an occasion in the near future to do that.
Thank you, and thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody, also for bearing with my interruptions to polish a bit the time schedule. But now I would like to, I announced it before, we are happy that also Nicola Minasi, Ambassador of Italy to Bosnia and Herzegovina, is here with us today. So for a very final word and also a chance to wrap it up a bit, what we have discussed this morning, Ambassador Minasi, floor is yours for a quick remark.
Thank you, Matteo. And I would just like to say how happy I am. I can listen to this from Sarajevo, and I'm very happy IAI has brought it forward after talking about it a mere few days ago. Just to say that I found all your comments extremely interesting, and I would just like to add a couple of points. One is that seen from the ground, it's really fascinating in a way how really the EU is bad at communicating. The center of gravity of all the cooperation inevitably goes towards the EU. A lot has been done that has been very hard to tell in the news, for example, for transport cooperation, for cargo, for trucks. One of the reasons for that difficulty is that most of this has been going on through the Regional Cooperation Center based in Sarajevo, CEFTA, the DG for transport in Brussels. These are not sexy things to say. It's very hard to follow this. It's very hard to talk about it in the news, but something must be done. The other point I would just flag for future reflection is that, at least from Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's interesting to see that when also political players are used to, in a way, create political crisis and control them, when a real crisis comes in the region, suddenly the system reacts in a way remarkably well. And so I would end on this note that maybe this situation is also an opportunity for the region to step up also with the EU, and also for the EU to tune in a better way to the needs on the ground. So thank you very much again, and looking forward to more occasions like this.
Thank you, and we are now at the end of today's webinar on COVID-19 in the Western Balkans. I would like again to thank you all very much, the panelists who joined us today, and Adi Cherimagic, Renzo Davidi, Krisela Achkai, Zoran Nechev, and Shirda Mastorovitz. And I would like to remind you that today's meeting has been recorded, so there will be also the chance to view it again in a later moment. We've listened to views and voices from the Western Balkans, but please do stay tuned, because more e-conferences and webinars will come from Istituto Affari Internazionali in the coming days and weeks. And so I'm sure we will get the chance to speak about other important issues very soon again. And thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to Giuseppe for his technical support this morning, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.